it's very easy to be impressed by these models. It almost feels like magic when you prompt DALL-E 2 with a text description, and it produces a beautiful image that matches that description.
What's up, everybody? From Nautilus, I'm Brian Gallagher, and you're watching Behind the Scenes. Today I'm speaking with Raphaël Milliére. Raphaël is a philosopher of artificial intelligence and cognitive science at Columbia University, where he is currently a presidential scholar in society and neuroscience. Raphaël received his doctorate in philosophy from Oxford University, where he studied self-consciousness. And in his most recent article for Nautilus, which we're about to discuss, Raphaël explains why it's easy to be dazzled by the AIs companies like Google and OpenAI are developing right now. One Google engineer, for example, was so impressed by the company's Lambda AI chatbot that he made headlines claiming it was sentient or alive. But before we dive in, Raphaël, could you tell us a bit about your background? How did you become interested in questions about consciousness and artificial intelligence? And how would you describe what you're focusing on intellectually at this point?
Hi. Yes, I'm a philosopher of mind and cognitive science first and foremost. And I've been working on, as you mentioned, questions such as the nature of consciousness and self-consciousness for quite a while during my PhD at the University of Oxford. But I've also been in the background interested from the get-go about the recent progress of AI and machine learning that really has moved very fast since about 2012. That's around the time when deep learning has become really effective. And so I've been following this progress, and I've been thinking that there are all sorts of philosophical questions, some of them older questions that are kind of undergoing a renaissance right now, others that are new questions that are raised by the progress of this technology. And so I have wanted to, for a while now, to dedicate more time to these questions. And since I started my position at Columbia University, I have been working on some of these questions, focusing specifically on the kinds of AI models that can generate outputs such as text or images or other kinds of outputs.
So when you were at Oxford, did you go to undergrad at Oxford?
No, I didn't. I went to undergrad in France. I'm from Paris initially, so I went to Oxford for my PhD.
How did you get interested in cognitive science and questions about AI? Was it an early childhood interest, or did you just recently start to dive into this research area?
So I think I've always been interested in philosophical questions, I would say, asking broad questions about the world and about the mind, like many children. And sometimes when we grow up, then we kind of forget about these questions. But I've always wanted to keep asking them. And so that led me to pursue the study of philosophy. And initially, I was focusing more on abstract questions in the philosophy of mind, such as big metaphysical questions about the nature of consciousness. But I got a little bit frustrated with these questions because I sensed that it was difficult to make concrete progress on these very abstract, high-level philosophical questions. And so I thought that I would start seeking questions where I could build upon evidence, empirical evidence from science, from cognitive science, to make some more concrete headway. And so that's what led me to gradually move towards questions that are more empirically grounded and work more in the philosophy of cognitive science. And from there, that led me to work on AI specifically in recent years.
So do you want to describe what some of these new AI models are called and what some of their abilities are? What's so impressive about them?
Yes, so there is a shift or there has been a shift in AI research in recent years, where prior to this shift, you would train a model. So these are artificial neural networks that are loosely inspired by the human brain, although this is a gross kind of oversimplification. They're actually quite different in some ways from the human brain, but they're loosely inspired from the human brain. And the technology of neural networks has been around for a long time. It already existed. The basic ideas already existed in the 50s and 60s. But since the early 2010s, they have been much more efficient because we have, we've made a few breakthroughs theoretically, but also we have much more computational power available because computers have been getting more powerful, and we have also larger data sets. We're in the era of big data, so we have a lot of data we can feed these neural networks. And one of the key characteristics is that they can learn from data. They're like sponges. They can be trained on large data sets and learn to represent some features of that data set, some statistically salient features of the data. And so the shift that has been happening recently when it comes to training these artificial neural networks, it's a field called machine learning or deep learning, is that before you had to train networks on specialized data set to achieve certain tasks. So for example, if you wanted to train a network that could classify text documents, you had to train it on a specific data set of documents with a specific supervised learning objective. So you had to label documents by hand, for example, according to different classificatory labels, and then train your model to try to apply these labels. But now what we can do is pre-train some very, very, very large artificial neural networks on a lot of data, a humongous amount of data, and do so without manually labeling the data. So this is called self-supervised learning instead of supervised learning. So we do so merely by masking some parts of the data and letting the model try to predict what is the part that's missing. For example, with text, you can mask a word in a sentence and have the model try to predict the word. And by doing that, we've observed that you can have models that are pretty domain general, pretty general purpose. They can just do a bunch of tasks after training on all of this data without having been specifically designed for that task. So you see that with text generation models like GPT-3 from OpenAI, which was one of the first very big one that made the headlines in 2020. It can generate any kind of text, so you can prompt it by giving it, a few words or a few sentences. Then it will essentially autocomplete these sentences with more text. Except that if you prompt it to, for example, perform some kind of reasoning task, if you do it in the right way, it might be able to solve that reasoning task in the completion. You can prompt it with an arithmetic problem. You can prompt it with other things like a translation problem, and it will also be able to do that. So we see that on these downstream tasks that we give the models, they can do things that they haven't explicitly been trained for. And in the past year, we've seen some other of these models, even larger ones, like Palm from Google, for example. There's also a text generation model that can do impressive things like solving math problems or explaining jokes. And we've seen also some similar models that are trained not just on text, but also on images, such as DALL-E 2 from OpenAI, which can generate images from a text description in virtually any style and virtually any topic. And we even have models like Gato from DeepMind that have been trained on text, images, but also button presses and joint torques. And these models can even play video games, for example, or control real-world robots. So the shift that has been happening is that you can feed a bunch of data, as long as it's serialized data of any kind, to these models that have broadly the same kind of architecture. And it's remarkably efficient if you scale them up to a sufficient size to perform a bunch of downstream tasks.
And how excited and just eager to show off these new models have the companies been? Because it's just interesting to see so many people on Twitter who have access to this AI, I think including yourself, kind of showing off the ability to just give the AI some kind of text, even if the text is almost illogical or you wouldn't ever see it in real life. And here's the AI generating this crazy surreal image of what you wrote. So what have you seen in terms of people's reactions to using this new AI?
I think people, by and large, have been extremely impressed, to put it mildly. At least people outside of the research world, but even people within the research world. That's what I say in the article. It's very easy to be impressed by these models. It almost feels like magic when you prompt DALL-E 2 with a text description, and it produces a beautiful image that matches that description. But I think we have a responsibility. I say we. I'm referring to researchers, to try to resist this initial kind of urge to be really impressed by these models, not because they're not impressive, but because precisely it's not magic, and we can make an effort to gain a better understanding of how they work. I mean, we have a high level understanding of how they work. We know how these models are trained. We know which kind of data is fed to them. We know which kind of architecture they have. But these models are like black boxes in the sense that because they're trained on data and they learn by themselves to achieve certain uh, uh, goals, or to perform certain tasks, they're hard to interpret because you know what comes in, you know what comes out, but what happens in the middle is hard to interpret. When you feed a text prompt to DALL-E 2 and it produces an image, you can say at a high level how that works, but it's more difficult to exactly say how it goes from the text prompt to the image in any specific case. So there's a real problem with the opacity of these models, and that feeds into the problem of overinflating their competence or their capacities. And I think we as researchers have a responsibility to try to temper some of the misleading expectations that people might have. And so it's a delicate balance to find, because I myself, for example, have access to DALL-E 2, and I have been sharing some examples, some outputs from DALL-E 2 on Twitter, for example. And of course, I showcase some of the really impressive capacities that these kind of models can have. But I also want to showcase the limitations, because I don't want to give misleading expectations. And I also want to emphasize, like I do in the article, that these models do not have a lot of the properties that some people who might not be familiar with how they work might ascribe to them. So they do not have beliefs, they do not have goals, they do not have personality traits, they do not have sentience, despite the recent story with Blake Lemoine that you mentioned. And they do not have a lot of things that we associate with human-like intelligence. But when it comes to really pinning down exactly, in a more specific way, what kind of cognitive competence we can ascribe to them, if any, it becomes a little bit more difficult to make conclusive statements. And that's why I also try to articulate. That's what I try to articulate in the article. I think some people on one extreme of the spectrum have been hardline skeptics and have said that these models are no smarter than a toaster, and that they're just like stochastic parrots that are haphazardly stitching together bits and pieces from the training data. And I think that perhaps overly deflates what these models are really doing. And then on the other end of the spectrum, you have another quite radical take on these models that I think is more damaging in many ways, which is the kind of AI evangelism or AI hype that have people say things like these models are perhaps a little bit sentient, or these models are approaching human-like intelligence, so these models can perform reasoning like humans do, or these models have things like beliefs, goals, desires, and so on. And I think we ought to be very careful about what we say.
So could you speculate a little bit about why a Google engineer like Blake Lemoine would have thought that the Lambda chatbot achieved sentience? Like, I mean, should he know better? He was, I'm not sure, but was he working on this chatbot, or did he just come across it at Google? Like, what is so convincing to him that he would come out and make this kind of big statement that got headlines?
So if I remember correctly, Blake Lemoine was not involved in the design of Lambda. So Lambda is one of these models, large pre-trained models that was fine-tuned specifically for conversation. So it's a conversational agent or chatbot, right? So it can mimic a conversation fairly well and give the illusion of speaking to someone else, to another human. Blake Lemoine, I think, was not involved in designing Lambda. He was not one of the co-authors of the Lambda paper, as far as I can remember. I think he took it upon himself because he had access to the model internally at Google to try to evaluate it. And in the process became somehow convinced that Lambda was sentient and that it was a person, that it should be given the status of personhood. And I think he should have known better, but he said himself that these beliefs were impressed upon him because of his religious faith. So he is a deeply religious person, and his religion, has given him a certain idea of what personhood is, what sentience is, and how to detect it and ascribe it in interaction with other things, or perhaps animals, and in that case, an algorithm. And I think that has given him a very misleading idea of and methodology to ascribe things like sentience and personhood, which, by the way, are two different things in philosophy. I think we ought to distinguish between sentience, personhood, intelligence. All of these are different things. But if we just focus on sentience for a second, basically, Blake Lemoine interacted with Lambda and asked it questions. And a lot of them, if you read the transcripts, are very leading questions. So it's no wonder that Lambda, based on these leading questions, provided precisely the kind of answer that someone who would want to find sentience in an algorithm would want to hear. But essentially, Lambda, in its answers, talks about feelings, talks about things that we humans associate with consciousness, right? But this is just precisely the kind of output that you would expect a model trained like Lambda to produce, right? Because in Lambda's training set, in Lambda's training data set, there would be possibly hundreds or thousands of stories that involve sentient robots or sentient AIs. And so Lambda is just playing a language game here. It's just engaging in creative fiction. It's basically answering as would a sentient AI in a science fiction story, like in 2000: A Space Odyssey or something. And so I think Blake Lemoine, should have recognized that this was what was happening here, and that the ability to walk the walk, as it were, to mimic something like a sentient AI is definitely not evidence for actual sentience in an algorithm.
So what for you would be convincing if an AI were to talk about what it's feeling, what its goals are, what it aims to do? How would you be able to tell the difference between an AI that is just mouthing words that it was trained on and one that has genuine intention and consciousness behind what it's trying to get across?
So I think looking simply at linguistic outputs, like we do with a model like Lambda, or like Blake Lemoine has done with a model like Lambda, just talking to it and looking at its answers, it's just not the right kind of target, or the right kind of potential evidence we should look at when thinking about whether an algorithm would have something like sentience or consciousness. Precisely because the capacity to talk at all, or to provide linguistic outputs, and specifically the capacity to talk about consciousness or sentience, is neither a sufficient nor a necessary condition for having sentience. So, for example, most people would agree that a number of animal species are capable of having conscious experiences and have sentience, right? So think about your pet, your dog or your cat, or think about apes, think about cephalopods, all sorts of animals that have very sophisticated intelligent behavior and that react to noxious stimuli in ways that seem absolutely consistent with having sentience, but also animals that share a lot of neurobiological structures with us. So these animals, most people are prepared to say are sentient, and yet they cannot speak and they cannot talk about their feelings. So talking about one's feelings shouldn't be a necessary condition for ascribing sentience. And it's also not sufficient precisely because of what happens in cases like large language models like Lambda that are very good at mimicking, giving the illusion of speaking about sentience, speaking about their feelings, but they don't really have feelings. So I think we ought to consider a broader cluster of evidence that includes, looking into the models themselves, or looking into the brains of animals when it comes to animals, and looking at the kind of structures that these systems have, biological systems like organisms or artificial systems like algorithms, and looking at whether these systems can sustain the kind of computations or computational complexity that we find in humans associated with conscious experiences or sentience. So that's one piece of evidence. But of course, it's complicated because we don't yet have a fully worked out scientific theory of consciousness, even for humans. There are various competing theories, and the science of consciousness is still very young. So I think the best we can do right now is look at the different competing theories we have, the best theories of consciousness we have scientifically, and look at what kind of predictions they make, both in terms of behavior the behavior of a conscious system, but also in terms of the kind of computations that or information processing complexity that such a system would have. And that all taken together would be a better guide to start making some speculations about sentience in both biological and artificial systems than just looking at linguistic outputs.
In the piece, you write that much of the recent progress in AI has been driven by sheer engineering prowess and not groundbreaking theoretical innovation. So, what are some of the examples you would give that illustrate that engineering prowess? And then, what might a groundbreaking theoretical innovation look like? And would this be connected to some of the best theories we have on consciousness at the moment?
Right. So in the piece, I don't focus on consciousness that much. I focus more on the notion of intelligence, which, as I mentioned, is a notion I would like to keep separate from sentience or consciousness. Right. You could conceive of a system or an organism that is not very intelligent in terms of its, for example, problem-solving capacities, and yet has sentience. Perhaps there are very simple organisms in the animal world that have sentience, and yet we wouldn't consider very intelligent. And conversely, it's not impossible that you would have an artificial system that eventually we build that displays very sophisticated intelligent behavior and yet lacks sentience, right? So I keep these two things separate. And in the article, I am mostly concerned with intelligence. But regarding that claim that you mentioned from the article, what I mean is that basically all of these large pre-trained models that I mentioned, GPT-3, PaLM, DALL-E 2, and so on, Lambda as well, they're all based on roughly the same architecture, roughly the same kind of underlying structure. And this is an architecture from 2017, which is quite old. So that's five years in the world of AI research is a lifetime. It's called the transformer architecture, and it has proven remarkably effective and remarkably responsive to scaling. So by scaling, we mean taking an artificial neural network and just adding more layers and more neurons to that network, what we call more parameters, free parameters that can be tweaked during the training of the network. And so what has been happening in the past 5 years is that people have been designing, building, and training larger and larger networks based on this transformer architecture on more and more data. So we've been scaling the models, adding more parameters, and also scaling the data sets. And that's where the engineering prowess comes in, because when you scale these models and you scale the data sets, you need more and more computational power. So you need these gargantuan clusters of chips to train the model on, and that's logistically very complicated and very costly. And you have to use all sorts of tricks to optimize the training run and to utilize these chips as efficiently as possible. And there are all sorts of things that can go wrong during training. You have an army of engineers that have to be there on call to fix that. So training these models is by no means trivial. It's very complex from an engineering perspective. But in terms of fundamental theoretical breakthroughs, all of these models are based on the same underlying transformer architecture with some tweaks that are more or less minor. I mean, you could debate how important the tweaks are, but still, they rely on the same architecture. So, we could speculate for a long time about what kind of what will be the next big thing in terms of architectural breakthrough or theoretical breakthrough. And if I knew the answer to that, I could write the next paper and become famous for achieving the next breakthrough in AI. So a lot of people are working on that, and it's unclear at this point, what will be what could be a novel architecture that really beats the transformer, is more efficient than the transformer, or that merely scaling up a transformer. What we've observed, and this is something that the researcher Richard Sutton called the bitter lesson in AI research, is that for now, at least, scaling up these models is more efficient and leads to better results than trying to be smart and find better architectures. It's a bit unsatisfying as a researcher, because you would like to think that we humans can come up with smart, groundbreaking new designs to improve these models. But right now, it's more of a brute force approach where we just throw a bunch of data and a bunch of computation at them and see that they actually do better.
And some researchers actually argue that that's all you need, right? That scaling is all you need. You just add more computational power, more and more data, and eventually you will achieve something like human-like intelligence. Maybe the analogy is that, like, look, this is what happened over evolutionary time. The brain got bigger and bigger, and it became familiar with different kinds of data, and this is what is happening in the world of deep learning and AI. So what would be the counter perspective to that?
Yes, so some people, at least some vocal people, perhaps a vocal minority of people, especially on Twitter, have recently pushed the view that scaling up these transformer-based models might be all we need to achieve something like human intelligence or artificial general intelligence, a kind of artificial intelligence that could solve a very broad range of problems and generalize to unknown problems in the way humans can. I think this was a fringe view for a very long time, and I don't know. I mean, I would like to bet if you surveyed researchers in the AI industry, it would still be a minority view. But still, some people are now, including prominent researchers like researchers at DeepMind, are now fairly sympathetic to that view. And I think that view is misguided for a few reasons. So you mentioned evolution and the evolution of the human brain. It's worth noting that the human brain, the organization of this human brain and the structure of the human brain is orders of magnitude more messy and complex than what you find in a transformer-based model. Right? So in the brain, you have all sorts of recurrent connection, feedback loops. You have all sorts of specialized circuits and subnetworks and modules that you don't find in these large transformer models that are conceptually very simple. And you could describe fairly easily the basic building blocks of these models in a way that reverse engineering the architecture of the human brain, as it were, is extremely complex, and we're only still scratching the surface in neuroscience. So that's the first point I want to make, right? Clearly, the brain is doing a lot of things very differently from these models. But you could have a view that this is irrelevant, because you could say, well, human-like intelligence or artificial general intelligence is, as philosophers would say, multiply realizable. You can realize it in different substrates. So different physical substrates, like the human brain versus a computer chip, computer circuits. So a carbon-based life form versus a silicon-based hardware. But also perhaps you could realize it even in different architectures. Even if you abstract away from the physical substrates, perhaps the architecture of the human brain or animal brains is one way to get to this kind of general intelligence, and perhaps there are other ways to get there. Just looking at that is not the differences in terms of the organization of the brain and these networks is perhaps not an argument. I think perhaps a better argument is just to look at how children learn to solve problems and to generalize across an extreme range of possible problems, including unknown problems. And what you see is that children learn in a very different way from what current transformer-based algorithms learn. The way current algorithms learn is completely passive. So they're just fed a huge amount of data, a torrential stream of data, and they learn from that data without interacting with the world at all. They just get bombarded with text data and images. They don't roam the world and causally interact with the world in the way humans do. And my sense is that causal interaction with the world is crucial for the way in which children learn to develop the right kinds of representations about the world across different sensory modality, not just vision, but also tactile, auditory, and other sensory modalities. And also how they learn to represent the causal structure of the world, they learn to represent causality and not just correlations between events. So that's one big difference. But it doesn't end there. Like, children can learn from relatively scarce data, whereas current models need a huge amount of data, orders of magnitude more data than children, to even have the slightest chance at doing as well in solving tasks. Children can generalize very easily to completely new problems from very few examples of the problem in a way that current models still struggle with. Another difference is that current models get trained just once. They have this training phase, and then all of the weights in the model, which are the things that are adjusted during training, get frozen. They're no longer changed. And then you can prompt the model to perform certain tasks, but it stops learning. It's no longer learning. Whereas with children and humans generally, we're continuously learning. We call this in psychology lifelong learning. So humans keep learning over the course of their whole lifetime. They never stop learning. We don't have just like a training event and then just inference events where we're no longer learning. So that's another big difference. And finally, children and humans generally have intrinsic goals and desires and beliefs about themselves and about the world. And that's something that's still very much missing from current models. They're not intrinsically motivated. They don't have intrinsic goals. They don't have beliefs. They don't have desires. And this is why they also lack personality traits. And this is why you can interact with a chatbot like Lambda, and you can have it mimic any kind of agent. In the case of the interaction with Blake Lemoine, it was behaving as if it were some kind of sentient AI. But there's an example from the Lambda paper where they interact with the model and they ask it leading questions and prompt it to respond as if it was a mountain and answering questions with various facts about what a mountain is and various facts about mountains. And you could do that with any kind of entity. These don't have stable personality traits. They don't have a sense of identity. They don't have a sense of self. All of this is still missing from these models.
So also in the article, you mention a group of researchers that have called these large pre-trained models basically parrots or stochastic parrots. And the idea is that when a parrot talks, it can say words, maybe even sentences and phrases. And that may for a moment seem impressive, but we know that there's really nothing behind that, no human-like intelligence behind the human words that the parrot is speaking. So what is this idea exactly that these AIs are like stochastic parrots? And then why don't you say what your take on that idea is, and what you think is a better way to describe these kind of models?
Yes, so there is a very influential paper that came out somewhat recently from Timnit Gebru, Emily Bender, Margaret Mitchell, and colleagues. Um, that is titled "Stochastic Parrots" with a subtitle, and it pushes this idea that these models are a bit like parrots, and this comes with caveats because real life parrots are actually quite smart, right? A lot of birds are quite intelligent, and they can solve a bunch of problems. But they mean that in the more colloquial sense of the term parrot. We think of something parroting as sentences, for example. And the idea here is that a parrot, in that colloquial sense, is just repeating canned sentences, and it has no understanding of what the sentences mean. Is just engaging in this game of just imitation. And these researchers make the point that current models are like that because if you take large language models and they focus on these large language models just trained on text, the way in which they're trained is that they're given sequences of text that are randomly sampled from their huge training data. And they're asked at each training event to predict what word follows from this sequence of text. Um, so to give you an example, if the sequence is I put my hand on the handle to open the ... um, you might be able to predict that the word that follows, statistically speaking, is likely to be door, to open the door, because a door is the kind of thing that has a handle that one puts one's hand on. And so the specific combination of words in the sequence statistically has a high likelihood to be followed by the word door. And that's the kind of thing, the kind of process that happens during training these models over and over and over for an absurd amount of times over different sequences of text until these models are capable to complete any kind of sequence in a way that is statistically plausible based on the statistics of their training data. And so they see that as a form of parroting, right? The model is trained on all of these training sequences, and then they say that it can kind of haphazardly stitch together bits and pieces from this training data, kind of regurgitating some sequences that they've memorized over the course of training, just like a parrot would just memorize sentences and then just repeat them. And in my article, I push back a little bit against that metaphor. I think it serves its use in pushing back against inflated claims or hype about AI models, because people might have misleading expectations of what these models can do, and calling them stochastic parrots might be somewhat useful to temper expectations and remind people that these are not intelligent systems in the way that we humans are intelligent. And they don't have quite the same kind of capacities we can ascribe to humans, quite the same kind of understanding of language. That being said, I think they do more than just parroting in that sense of just repeating memorizing canned sentences. There's lots of evidence that these models are able to form new sentences that are meaningful to us and that are not sentences found in the training data. And we find this emergent behavior in these models, as I mentioned, from the larger ones, such as explaining jokes or solving math problems, that cannot be easily explained by any kind of memorization. In fact, we can quantify how much memorization happens in these models. Some people have done that, and while there is some behavior that can be explained by memorization, a lot of their behavior that strikes us as quite sophisticated is not fully explainable by memorization. So there's something more happening there. And it's very tricky to provide a reasonable, empirically grounded, well-informed view of exactly what it is that these models can do that goes beyond memorization. So in the paper, I propose to say at the very least that we can consider a lot of the things that these models can do as a form of mimicry, where I would argue mimicry is more than parroting. Mimicry involves kind of not just repeating sequences that you've seen in your training data, but imitating or mimicking the behavior of the kind of thing that has produced your training data. So in the case of these models, training data might contain text or images, and we are able to train models that are just not just memorizing text and images and regurgitating them, as it were, but actually mimicking the creation process for these text and images, being able to create brand new sentences and brand new paragraphs and brand new images that are mimicking the style of humans creating text or images, for example. So you can have models that can generate whole paragraphs in the style of Hemingway, or models that can generate paintings in the style of Van Gogh, for example. So at the very least, they're doing something like this, like mimicry, which is more sophisticated than parroting, in my view. And then the problem is that sufficiently advanced mimicry becomes hard to distinguish from proper intelligence. Of course, intelligence itself is a very difficult term to define. And in the article, I suggest that when it comes to the more sophisticated behavior of these algorithms, we are starting to see that they are going beyond mimicry, beyond mere mimicry. Even something like solving a math problem, or explaining jokes, or doing some other things that we see these models can do, seem to already go beyond mimicry. And here it's interesting to speculate about exactly the right way to characterize what this is. I suggest in the article that we see inklings of intelligent behavior. And the next step now that we ought to do, the work we ought to do as researchers, is to try to interpret the computations that are going on into these models. Just go beyond looking at the behavior, open up these models, perform all sorts of causal interventions to try to figure out what kinds of computations they can carry out. And that's a very hard, difficult challenge.
And you use the analogy, or you describe these abilities to seemingly intelligently mimic as chameleon-like, as a kind of camouflage. Like cuttlefish can intelligently copy the environment that they're in, and so can chameleons. And that involves some kind of intelligent machinery that can adapt to its environment very fluidly. And like what I think of when you mentioned that was like, if you were to ask 10 people, and one of them being a language AI, to write a paragraph in the style of Hemingway, you probably wouldn't be able to pick out which one was the AI trying to do this. So they can blend in super well. I mean, that's just how I understood what I think is a very apt metaphor there. These chameleon-like abilities to blend in.
Yes, and in fact, if you ask 10 people to write a paragraph in the style of Hemingway, and you prompted GPT-3 to also do that, perhaps you might be able to tell which paragraph was written by GPT-3, not because it's inferior, but because it's superior, because it's even better than the average at imitating Hemingway. It's too good, exactly. But yeah, so I use this metaphor to push back against the stochastic parrots metaphor. I say in the article, if you want to use the animal metaphor, perhaps a more apt one would be that of a stochastic chameleon, because while parrots just repeat canned sentences or canned sequences, chameleons can blend in any environment based on context. That's not totally true, because actually the ability of chameleons to change color is largely for signaling based on their internal states. It's not that much for camouflage, although they do use it a little bit for camouflage. But cuttlefish would be a better example, although the phrase stochastic cuttlefish might be less catchy. Just like the phrase stochastic parrots, I'm using here the more colloquial meaning of chameleon. But yes, cuttlefish are fascinating animals. Are these cephalopods that are related to octopuses. And like octopuses, but to perhaps an even greater extent, they can change the color of their skins with these special cells, chromatophores and other cells. And they can do so by sampling the colors in the environment with their sophisticated eyes, and then accordingly changing their skin color to blend in with the environment. So it's a really incredible camouflage. And you can look at that and think, well, that's a really advanced, sophisticated form of mimicry. That is a very intelligent form of mimicry. But you can also look at what cuttlefish do and observe that cuttlefish themselves are not, although they are very intelligent animals, and I'm not taking anything away from their intelligence, when they engage in camouflage, they're not explicitly analyzing their environments and thinking hard about how can I change my skin color to blend in my environment. This all happens quickly and automatically. So there's a sophisticated mechanism of mimicry that does not really involve by itself a sophisticated form of intelligence. The way in which the intelligence of cuttlefish is displayed is through their problem-solving behavior, but that's a different story. And so I suggest that in the same way, we should be careful not to conflate the mimicry-like capacities of large pre-trained models with human-like intelligence. That being said, I do venture further in the article in suggesting that the chameleon metaphor is not completely apt. It's a starting point, but these models are now starting to show, as I mentioned earlier, some behavior that seems to go beyond mere mimicry. And this is where I think it's more apt to start talking about intelligence or some forms of intelligence. And we can break it down into some more specific claims about the kinds of capacities that we can ascribe to these models. So I think the stochastic parrots metaphor is inept. It's inadequate. The stochastic chameleon metaphor is a better starting point, but it is also ultimately insufficient because we are now moving beyond mimicry, hence the title of the article.
So what do you think, which companies do you think are on the leading edge of developing these inklings of intelligence with their models, like Google, OpenAI, or even Tesla with self-driving cars? Where do you see the most rapid and genuine progress happening on intelligence?
So OpenAI has been on the forefront of developing these large pre-trained models ever since the days of the GPT models, first GPT, then GPT-2. GPT-2 was the first one that really made the headlines, and then GPT-3 in 2020 is the one that really wowed everyone and convinced everyone that scaling up these models was tremendously efficient. And since then, other companies have come up with their own large models. But I think one of the companies that is really leading the charge in terms of really thinking about how to leverage these inklings of intelligent behavior that I mentioned in these models might be DeepMind. DeepMind has been not just focusing on scaling, but also focusing on training these models more efficiently by optimally finding the right ratio of size, the size of these models to the size of the training data. They train a model called Chinchilla, which is more optimal than GPT-3 in that respect, and it is smaller than GPT-3, yet performs equally well or even better in some ways. And they also have been leading the charge in terms of, I think, innovation in that realm with models like Gato that are not just trained on text and images, but also on other kinds of data like button presses. And a model like Flamingo, which has been trained on text and images and is able to describe the content of images and reason over the content of images. So I think DeepMind, which is a subsidiary of Google, is one of the most interesting companies in terms of doing fundamental research on these models and not just blindly scaling up these models. But all of these companies are doing, and by all of these I mean Google, DeepMind, OpenAI, Meta AI are doing a lot of work at the moment on these models. There are also new startups that have started appearing, like Anthropic AI, Cohere AI. There are some others that are heavily investing in developing these models and improving them. So it's anyone's best guess where the next big next big thing will come from.
All right, Raphael, the article is Moving Beyond Mimicry and Artificial Intelligence. You haven't read it, go ahead and read that. And do you want to tell our viewers where they can find you online? If you have a website or a Twitter, you do have a Twitter. You've been sharing a lot of cool images. And anything you want to say you're working on?
Sure. So you can find me indeed on Twitter at Raphaël Milliére. That's my first name, my last name without accents altogether. You can find me online on my website, raphaelmilliere.com, same thing. And you can also find on my website, you can find my latest work, but I will share on Twitter things I'm working on, so you can find that there. I have a number of ongoing papers on these kind of models that elaborate on some of the ideas that I presented in this article. And if you're interested in hearing more about this and asking me questions, I'm actually doing a fireside chat on Clubhouse tonight on this article. That's at I think 9:30 p.m. Eastern time. It was also shared on Twitter, so you can find that there.
Oh, that's fantastic. All right. Well, thanks so much for coming on the show.
My headphones actually just died, but let me just...
No worries.
So sure, there we go.
I just said that was great. It's awesome that you're doing a Clubhouse chat on the piece, and just wanted to thank you for coming on the show. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me.